Render properties in Blender are crucial for fine-tuning the look and feel of your animations in Blender and a whole lot more. So let's talk about everything you need to know about them right now. So in this video, I'm once again using Kaoru Sakaki's Animate Base Mesh. You do not need to download this to follow along. You could just, follow along, watch the video and take notes if you want to. But if you do want to follow along, I will have a link to download this in the description below, along with a link to the original post and Kaoru Sakaki's work, because it's really, really good. So for this tutorial, I'm going to use Eevee, which we can go to the render tab right here and see that I have selected as my active render engine. That's just because Eevee is really quick and a lot more easy to demonstrate what these settings actually do. You're going to get a completely different set of settings, but if you can go to cycles here, you're going to see, because Eevee is a real-time renderer. It's a real-time renderer in the same way that game engines are, like Unity or Unreal, where things are fast, they're instant, you can preview what's going on immediately at the cost of realism, right? So a lot of the things in Eevee, like the shadows and the lighting, a lot of this stuff is totally hacked and faked. It's not realistic or it's like not usually ray traced. It's usually just using a bunch of hacks and techniques to quickly simulate what that kind of feels like for things like refractions and shadows and lighting, all that kind of stuff. So Eevee is great for me because I really love non-photorealism. I love things that are kind of pushed and exaggerated, but Cycles is really good for photorealism. But for this tutorial here, we're going to use Eevee because that's just kind of what I use for all of my stuff. So first setting I'm going to talk about here is Viewport Denoising. I'm going to be honest, I almost always have that off because, and I'm not going to be able to preview it here, but basically Viewport Denoising adds a ghosting effect. Even if you hover over it here, it says it denoises the image using temporal reprojection and can leave some ghosting. So when you're animating and you're playing back your animations, you're going to see a lot of like ghosting behind your character and stuff that's really distracting, and I imagine doesn't help the performance of your viewport either. So I almost always have this off, honestly. I don't like how it looks. I don't feel like my images in Eevee even need denoising most of the time. So I almost always have that off personally. Next up here is Ambient Occlusion, which we're not going to see the changes of because we are actually in solid view right now. So to change our render view in Blender, we can press C, and I will go to rendered view right here, which also changes our view right there. And this looks pretty ugly. I don't like how this looks because all I did to get this character in our scene is go to File, Import, FBX. This is just the default Blender scene other than that. And I deleted our cube, of course. So I'm gonna change this to a sunlight by clicking on our light here, going to sun, then pressing RR to rotate it like this. Then lower the strength down way more to like 10, even lower than 10, like that. All right, so we'll have one sun right here, like this. Then I'll Shift D to duplicate our sun, rotate the sun behind our character, increase the strength to 10, so we get like a little bit of rim lighting behind her like that. There we go. All right, so now with our lighting setup, let's go back to the render tab right here and turn on Ambient Occlusion. So when we turn on Ambient Occlusion, you're going to see that there's a very subtle shift in this character. Actually, this is actually like way more obvious in other scenes, but I'll make it super obvious by zooming in on her torso area here and turning it on. And you can see that by clicking this option Enable, we're getting more subtle shadowing here like so. So Ambient Occlusion is awesome because it can give a really nice like indirect shadowing effect on small crevices in your scene and just make them look a lot more believable and realistic. I think we'll even see a little bit of that on her hand here. It's very subtle. It's actually extremely subtle in this scene. You know what? I'll get to a different scene to make this a little bit more obvious real quick. So here's another scene I'm working on right now. And if I go to the Render tab and go to Ambient Occlusion here and turn it on and off, it's going to be a little bit more obvious what this is actually doing. So keep on turning that on and off. It just creates a soft shadowing for occluded areas in your scene. So check out under the hair there, check out the ring in her hand here and under her neck. You're going to see that those areas become a lot more believable and realistic feeling. So Ambient Occlusion is really good for that kind of stuff. So that's what ambient occlusion does. I have that enabled a lot of the time. And right under ambient occlusion is this option right here called bloom. So bloom will essentially make bright areas in our scene bloom out and get like a soft haloing effect around them, which makes them feel a lot more believable and realistic almost. So if I enable it here, it's going to be real subtle. So I'm going to actually click on our light here and make this like 100 to make this super obvious what this is doing. Let's just do 55. 100's a bit much. So now if I go to my render properties tab and enable bloom, and zoom in here, you're going to kind of see what's happening, right? These heavily lit areas bloom out and get soft highlights around them. And it's awesome. I almost always have bloom enabled, even if it's very subtle, because it adds this really nice glowing effect around light sources. So that's a sunlight source, and that's one way to get the bloom effect. But if I have an emission in my scene, that's another really good way of showing off this effect. So I'll actually do that right now by clicking on our character here, going to their material properties tab, and switching them over to an emission. So an emission in Blender is just a glowing material. An emission is just a material that's glowing, basically. It's very common to use these in stylized 3D animations. So I'll set the strength of this to 2, and I'll even change the color just for fun to like green, I guess. Now, this is glowing, but it doesn't really feel like it's glowing until we go back to our render tab here, turn on bloom. Now it really feels like this is glowing, like she's radioactive or something, right? So bloom is a really good option if you want things to glow. You can also change the color right here. So I could change this to like blue or a red, which I love changing the color of this. If I'm changing a setting on bloom, it's either going to be the color or the threshold. Those are the ones I use the most often. So I can press backspace on those to set them to default, of course. So yeah, that's bloom. I'm going to switch this back to principled BSDF, which is what we were on, and go back to our render tab here. So that's bloom. There's also depth of field, which is mostly a camera controlled setting, but sometimes I do use this high quality slight defocus and jitter camera settings right here. So those are nice. Screen space reflections are another extremely useful setting to have in Eevee. Again, a screen space reflection is not physically accurate. 90% of everything Eevee is doing is not physically accurate, but it can really pump up your realism and make things feel a lot more realistic. So by enabling this right now, you're going to see that there's actually even a little bit of effect here, even on this material, even though it's kind of, diffuse and not super specular. You can see that there's a little bit more of a highlight under her arm here, but it's pretty subtle, right? But if I turn this off and then go to our material properties once again and make her, because we're on principled BSDF, make this a metallic material by dragging this to the right, this is what our metallic material is going to look like right now. And this is fine. It's clearly not super realistic. Kind of reminds me of like Mario 64 metal, but it's not that bad. However, if we enable screen space reflections, you're going to see that you get a lot more of a realistic like reflection in the metal itself, which is really cool. And I believe it will also kind of reflect the elements we have in our scene here. So I should try that by spawning in a mesh. I hope I'm not wrong about this. That'd be embarrassing. No, yeah, it does. Okay. So see if we'll make this a new material. We'll make this an emission, just make this super obvious. Make it a green emission. So you can see that this is screen space reflections is actually taking the data from our scene and our camera to calculate like reflections off of different things in our scene as well, which just makes this metallic effect, glass effects, reflections in general, a lot more realistic feeling. So if I turn this off, you'll see we have none of that, but if I turn this on again, we have that kind of reflection, which is awesome. So that's cool, right? But there's also this refraction setting in screen space reflections. So there's reflections, which are the reflections in our scene, but then there's refraction. So refraction is kind of, think of like a glass bottle or any kind of glass container, really. When light is going through that glass, it gets refracted and kind of gives the glass that warbly effect when you're looking through it, and everything through it looks a little bit, looks a little warbly. That's kind of what refraction is. So if I enable refraction here, we're going to see basically no change because this is a completely metallic surface, right? But if we click on our material tab once again on our character here, and we go to glass BSDF. So click on glass BSDF. We can already see a little bit of our cube here because we have the screen space refractions. However, if we move our character to the side here, we're actually not going to see them through the cube, which you would kind of expect if this is glass, right? Because you can see through glass. That doesn't feel right. And the reason for that is we need to go to our settings on our material here and enable screen space refraction, which is actually ray trace screen space refraction. It's pretty neat. Eevee. So if I enable this, now you can see that, oh yeah, this is starting to feel way more like glass because, and I'll make this smaller to make this a little bit more obvious what's happening here. Move it like this. Now this feels like glass where it's kind of refracting things around it as they become like behind the object. So if I turn that off again, you're going to see with that we don't have that effect through the object. We only have the reflections for the cube, which we can't even see because it's not big enough and close enough. But now we have the refractions through the surface itself, which makes it feel a lot more glass-like. We could probably even change the roughness to make it even more, to kind of exaggerate that effect, right? So that's pretty cool. That's what screen space refractions are. They kind of add a transparent refraction effect to your objects in your scene. So I guess we'll just leave it like that for now, because the next option, which is super important for animation, is motion blur. If you're making an animation at 24 FPS and rendering it out without motion blur, you are shooting yourself in the foot. It's going to look super stuttery, and you're not going to have a good time looking at that animation. And if you're doing most animations, unless you're exporting to a game engine, you should probably just be animating them at 24 FPS anyway. It's a standard for a reason. So by enabling motion blur, when we move our objects in our scene, they're going to have motion blur, right? So if I turn on auto key here, press P to set my play range from 1 to 25, we'll say. Then press I to insert a location, rotation, and scale. Go to frame 25, move it on the x-axis like this. Then I'm going to move my camera by pressing 0 on my numpad, pressing Shift plus tilde, go right next to my cube to make this motion blur super obvious. Then I go to frame 14 here, go to render image. You're going to see that our cube is super blurry. If I turn off motion blur, go to render image, our cube is like razor sharp, which is great for certain styles and certain things, but you have an animation at 24 FPS, again, please enable motion blur. It's going to look real rough if you don't. The only settings you need to worry about here are the shutter speed and the steps. The shutter speed is basically how much blur your motion blur has. So if I drag this all the way to the right, go to render image, render image, not render animation, silly me. That's going to be super blurry. And if I drag this all the way to the left to render image, it's going to basically be like pin razor sharp. So that's your blur amount, basically. I usually keep that around like 50 or like 75, depending on the shot, right? And steps is basically your motion blur quality level. I usually keep this for a final render for animation. I'll usually put this at like 2 or 3. So if we render this out, render image like so, it just makes the motion blur quality a little bit higher. There's a more sampling there, so it's a lot less pixelated and aliased, basically. So that is motion blur. There's also volumetrics, which I don't have in my scene, and I'm not going to bother adding to my scene because it's like a whole thing. But basically, volumetrics are a way to add things like clouds, smoke, and volumes into your scene, which is really good for realism and PBR stuff, but probably not what you're going to use if you're doing like stylized animations anyway. But these are good options to explore. Tile size, putting that lower will make your volumetrics higher resolution, and volumetric shadows will add shadowing in your volumetrics, which is also another very useful setting to have. Other than that, though, there's also shadows right here. So if I click on our character here, go back to this being a principled BSDF, and zoom in on them. If we increase the shadow resolution like so to 4K, this is going to dramatically lower our performance in our scene, but it makes our shadows a lot more realistic and sharp, and makes them look much, much nicer. So if you can raise the resolution on your shadows, I'd highly recommend it in Eevee, but wow, that actually changes the definition of the light. That's crazy. Wow. I don't know if I've ever seen that before. Well, I can kind of show you how important increasing this resolution on the shadows can be for accuracy and realism, but also just to make them less aliased and pixelated. So keep that in mind if you're rendering out in Eevee. There's also these indirect lighting settings, which, again, this is not a super useful thing if you're doing stylized animations, but if you go to Shift-A and add light probes, this is basically how you bake them out into your scene. So you can kind of simulate bounce lighting in your scenes, which can make them feel a lot more realistic. But again, I don't use that super much because I like stylized stuff. The only other thing I want to talk about is film. This is extremely, extremely important. This is how you render in using transparency in Blender. So by clicking transparent right here, this makes our background transparent. So if I pressed 0 and did a render again, so I got a render image, now our background is completely transparent. Otherwise, if we didn't do this, our background would just render out as black pixels. So this is super useful if you need to composite anything in your animations, which you probably do want to do that. So if you want to have like the background be colored differently than the foreground, you want to do some kind of stylized effect in the background in like, you know, an editing software, that is an extremely, extremely useful setting. I use this constantly. It's one of the most important settings in this tab by far, is this transparent setting. I don't even know what filter size or overscan does. I would ignore them. Just mess with transparent. So yeah, simplify is really good to have. It is great for animation because it basically will limit how high a subdivision modifier can get. So if you have a rig with a lot of subdivision modifiers on it and you need more performance as you're making an animation, which a lot of rigs will have subdivision modifiers. I know that the rig I have right here has a bunch of subdivision modifiers. So if I enabled simplify, turn this way down, she becomes super blocky, which, you know, doesn't look fantastic, but it makes the frame rate in our viewport a lot higher because there's less for the computer to think about and process. So that's what subdivision does. Very useful for animation. If you're running into issues getting with your scene slowing down dramatically, mess with the simplify setting because it's really important. Make sure to lower that max subdivision level to like 1 or 0 even. I don't know why it's at 6 by default. That seems really extreme. And yeah, the only other one I want to talk about today is color management. This is probably one of the most common mistakes I've seen beginners make in Blender, where they'll be making a scene kind of like this one, where it's let's turn off simplify so she looks less crunchy. It's a scene like this one, right? Where this is clearly a stylized character and a stylized art style. You know, we're kind of pushing things quite a bit here when it comes to the art style we're shooting for, but they'll leave their color management on the Blender default, which in this version of Blender was called Filmic, but in modern versions of Blender, it's called AGX. No, they're still Filmic, but by default, Blender is an AGX, which is another Filmic-esque color standard, I would say. So my recommendation to you is if you're doing stylized characters or anything like that, so say you're doing, you know, cartoon or an anime style in Blender, or you're doing things like animating Team Fortress 2 characters, which are from like a stylized game and a stylized art style, you absolutely do not want to be using Filmic you want to be using standard because that is the view transform for stylized rendering for NPR stuff. So this is what standard looks like on this model, for example, and this is what filmic looks like in this model. So you can see that it just looks lifeless and the colors look completely wrong and like desaturated and it looks bad. But if I put this to standard, we have our saturation back, everything looks colorful and poppy and it looks great. So standard is what you want to do for non-photorealistic animations. If you're going for photorealism, if you're really shooting, if you're like doing architectural visualization and stuff, of course, use filmic or use Ajax. I don't know how to pronounce that. Ajax? AGX? I don't know. But that's what you want to use for photorealism, for non-photorealism, for stylized stuff. Like I was just showing you, make sure to use standard. That's one of the most common mistakes I see beginners make in Blender. Now there are two ways of rendering your scenes out: animation renders and image renders. That's what we just did to demonstrate motion blur was an image render. But there's an even faster way of doing it, which are called viewport renders. That's what we're going to talk about in the next video, along with all of this tab, which is the output properties, which are super, super important to understand. So I'll see you in that video. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the Patreon if you want to become a part of our amazing, amazing community, and have a great day. Congratulations on finishing this tutorial. It might feel like a small step, but you're now one step closer to animation mastery. And if you want access to an exclusive Discord community, exclusive rewards, and help ensure that I can keep making tutorials for you just like this one, check out my Patreon.